So welcome everyone to our Delta Think News and Views webinar series. For those of you who've joined us before, welcome back. We're happy to see you again. And those who are new, we're glad you decided to join us today. First, let me start off with a few introductions. I'm Lori Carlin, Chief Commercial Officer here at Delta Think, and I'll be moderating the session for us today. With me are my colleagues, Heather Staines, Strategy Consultant here at Delta Think and Director of Community Engagement for our OA Data and Analytics tool, and Dan Pollock, our Chief Digital Officer, and along with Ann Michael, an architect of the OA Data and Analytics tool. If you've joined us for a News and Views webinar before, then you know these are designed to be very interactive with lots of questions and participation from you all. So I hope you're ready for a lively and informal discussion here today. A few logistical items before we begin. When you have questions, if you can ask them using the Q&A box, that would be really helpful. As far as structure, we'll have some opening remarks from Dan and Heather to start us off. They'll run through some of the information and data, and then we'll move on to questions and open discussion after that. If you have specific questions while anyone's slide is up, please put it in the Q&A. As I said, this is somewhat informal, so we'll try to fit those in as we're going along with those slides. And because this is meant to be informal, we have an hour scheduled for the session today. If there are less questions, we may end early. Just a very informal discussion based on your feedback. So thank you again for joining us, and I will hand over to Heather now to get us started.
Thanks so much, Lori. It's great to be here again today to talk about what's going on with open access charges. Just a little bit about, kind of what we'll cover in the session today, and there's a lot. We'll hit on the headlines, which some of you may have seen last week in the news and views that went out. We'll talk, of course, about how these are averages and your individual prices are very specific to you. So the impact of these headlines will certainly vary. We're going to dig in deeper into publisher type and how that affects everything related to the world of APCs. And then we'll talk about the spread of prices, both in the hybrid world and also in the gold world. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Dan to talk a little bit about the method and the headlines, and I'll be back with you in a bit.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Yes, it's echo Heather's thoughts. It's great to be talking to you all. So yes, every year around the end of January, beginning of February, we round up article processing charges, APCs, open access prices from a number of publishers, so we can then get a sense of the patterns and trends in open access pricing. We try and do the snapshot each time, roughly at the same time each year, so we can then compare like for like over the years. We'll come on to some of that later on. And then just so you know, in order to keep things consistent and compare like for like, we compare non-discounted APC charges, so no membership or anything like that, and we focus on those for the most permissive licenses, so CC BY or better. Of course, we acknowledge that many publishers may charge slightly different charges and fees depending on the license type or the type of article and so on and so forth, but we try and focus on a consistent set, so again we can get those like for like trends. Just to give you a sense of scale of the data set, we've probably got around 100,000, 120,000 now, kind of lost count, data points across about 20,000 or so titles going back around about 7 to 8 years. The journals in play vary slightly, so that 20,000 titles actually rolls up to about 15,000 or so in any one given year, and then that sample varies slightly as time goes on. So we think it's a pretty good sample. We think it covers around about 2 million or so published articles a year, perhaps around 60–70% of output, although it just depends where you draw that line, but we think it's a pretty good sample size of what's going on, and so therefore the patterns in it are interesting. I'm going to pause there. Heather, anything else we want to cover off on the methods?
I just wanted to just remind everyone that we do this as a snapshot, the same time every year. We recognize that the different publishers, release their pricing at different points. But as you said, and I think said it quite well, we want to make sure you can compare like for like, so this doing it at the same time every year and considering it to be 6 months in either direction in terms of the data, should hold for people analyzing trends.
Yep. So with that, if we can move on to the next, if actually let's hold here for a moment. So let's get you the headlines that we've come up with. What we find is that prices continue to rise every year. They seem to be settling down to a sort of average set of increases. So about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a sort of unusually high level of increase, and that was because some of the very, very high impact journals started offering hybrid APCs for the first time. They came in right at the top of the price range. But we'll come back to those in a second. But it now seems that the average price increases are just over 4%. So the average hybrid APC increased by 4% over last year, and the average fully open access APC increased by 4.2% over last year. And if we compare those with the price rises at this time last year, hybrids were 3.5%. So 3.5% last year, 4.2% this year. And fully open was 4.1% last year, compared with the 4.3% this year. So that kind of high threes, low fours seems to be where the averages are now settling. Just to briefly revisit these very, very high APCs. So the highest price point you will pay for a fully open access journal remains at $8,900. It's been that way for, I said, a couple of years since some of these high impact journals came into the market. But I think what we have seen this year is there are now more fully open journals operating at the higher end. So we're seeing a couple of dozen or so fully open journals charging $5,300 or more, compared with just a couple a few years ago. So it seems that kind of upper end of the market is beginning to fill out a bit. And then in terms of the highest price for a hybrid journal, that's now $11,690, and that's gone up to 2.6%, if you want to be exact. It's gone up about $300 compared with last year. Last year it was $11,390. This year it's $11,690, again at the very end of hybrid. And then I think the other headline, probably not so much a headline now, it's just a trend that we've observed, is that fully open journals tend to be cheaper than their hybrid siblings. A fully open journal will charge roughly 60% on average of the average hybrid. It's about 59% this year, 57% the year before, 58% the year before that. So that around about 60% fully open access compared with hybrid seems to be where the price is settling, and we've got a chart about that shortly. So that's a headline. Overall, prices continue to go up about 4% or so on average, and the very top end of the market much higher than that. And then I think, Heather, if you please move on to the next slide. I think it's worth noting that those averages mask variations. So that's something we're always very keen to stress with people, that those average numbers are very useful for understanding trends, but really your mileage may vary quite considerably. So what we've done here is we wanted to pick out a few subjects just so you could get a sense of the different spread of prices. So we've picked 4 subjects here: agricultural engineering, communications engineering, multidisciplinary, and I'm sorry, I can't remember, my screen's a bit too small, and geophysics. Really just to illustrate the spread. So for example, if you look at geophysics, that's the second pair of bars from the right. The left-hand bar of those, the little yellow bar, so geophysics fully open, geophysics is amongst the cheapest area to publish in. It has, amongst the cheapest fully open APCs on average. Compare and contrast that with the left-hand pair of bars and the leftmost bar within those, agricultural engineering. Agricultural engineering appears to be amongst the more expensive subjects to publish in fully open. So we're just comparing fully open, the left hand of each of the pairs. Compare and contrast that it so happens that agricultural engineering is also amongst the more expensive hybrid journals to publish in. Alongside multidisciplinary there, right on the right-hand side. The cheapest, or one of the cheapest subjects to publish in is communications engineering for hybrid. So there's a real spread. It absolutely depends on where you publish will dictate whether you're sort of publishing at the cheaper or the more expensive end of the market. The most expensive subjects for fully open could be about 3 times or so more expensive than the cheapest fully open. And a hybrid is about 2.5 to 1 ratio. And then, of course, the two ranges overlap. So the cheapest hybrids will be cheaper than the more expensive fully open. So the two sets of prices really do vary. And that's why we say to people, when you're looking at prices or indeed any of the other data points that we track across our tool, please come and speak to us, because what it means for you will really depend on you. Depend on where you're publishing, what you're doing, that will profoundly affect what's normal or what's cheap or expensive for your particular specialism in publishing. I'm going to stop there because I noticed there are some Q&A coming in, and also just invite Heather to bring in any observations as well.
One of the question there's 2 questions. One is directly related, so I'll go there, and then we can Heather can add some commentary. Can you reiterate the time/date at which the APC data was taken, so we know what date after which any changes in APCs would not be accounted for?
Yeah, last week in January. Times will vary. We do it through the week, so it takes a while to gather the data, but it's basically last week in January, maybe the first couple of days in February, so within that week. So any price rises landing after that date wouldn't be pulled into this year's data, but the ones from that date last year would be part of this year's data, if that makes sense. And then I think, as Heather said, we nominally consider those to be plus or minus 6 months for the sake of comparison. So, for example, if people had put their prices up in October or put their prices up at the end of the calendar year, they should be part of this data. But I know some publishers will change their prices late summer. So, of course, we won't have pulled those in just yet. But likewise, those publishers' price rises from the summer just gone would be in here. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and Heather, did you want to comment before we look at some other questions?
At first, I think I've just corrected the link in the chat, so thanks for the cut and paste foils me again. I just wanted to say, in terms of this slide, that I thought this was fascinating when Dan came up with these particular examples, and it made me wonder how these trends are going. Are these more traditional subject areas versus new subject areas for journals, and it's something that I really look forward to digging into more in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, and that's a good point. We're planning to put out we put out our monthly pieces. We've got a few ideas for further analysis we want to do, exactly as Heather says, to dig into this data, see if we can pull out some interesting trends.
Yeah, and another question we have, are we looking at the longevity of titles in the expensive hybrid versus the cheaper or less expensive full OA? And further explaining. Go ahead, Dan.
No, that is a really, really good question. Short answer is no, but we've made a note. That could be one of our future analyses. I think it's a really interesting question to see if newer titles are cheaper than older ones. We have written previously about how we think the pricing in this market is quite immature, and in particularly in fully open journals, that a lot of them are newer. So therefore are people keeping their prices low until those journals become established and then putting them up. And in some ways, I'm glad you asked that question, because we have a slide for that coming up. That's the next slide. Heather, I don't know if you want to bring that up now. which we'll speak to in a minute. And then I suppose the other aspect of that is in the question, I think, was about print costs and so on. So that's perhaps all covered here as well. So what we're looking at here is on the left-hand side of the chart, we're looking at different publisher types. So comparing publishers who are basically publishing fully open only. That's the left-hand group of bars. And then the right-hand two groups of bars are looking at what we term mixed model publishers. So publishers that will publish a mix of fully open journals and of hybrid journals. The reading right to left, the blue bars, the taller bars on that sort of very right-hand group, they're the average prices of hybrid journals. Each bar represents 1 year. So you can see how the prices are tracking. And we can see that those blue hybrid bars are much taller than the other ones. So again, we're seeing that significantly higher price of hybrid versus fully open. So that then opens up the conversation about, well, why do we think that is? I mean, I can kick us off on there. I think that there's going to be an element that because of hybrid prices are largely going to be set alongside the sort of subscription levels of pricing in those same journals. I'd imagine that's a price driver. But I mean, Heather, any other thoughts on that? What might be keeping those higher hybrids going?
I mean, certainly we have said in the past that those very high APCs are not necessarily tied to costs that journal is incurring, although some of those journals may kind of beg to differ, but that those are the prices that could be charged given a selectivity range or a prestige level for the journal. So it could well be that will continue going forward. But as we've pointed out before, you have a lot more ability to add more journal articles into OA journals. You don't have the capability to go back as frequently for hybrid, so you may need to account for the fact that you can't increase your subscriptions as frequently or as much as you might like, and there may be some compensation going on.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The fundamental economics of the two sorts of two types of journals are different, aren't they? And then, so that's the blue bit, the hybrid bit, and then the left and sort of center groups of bars, so looking at fully open journals. And something we felt was quite interesting this year, that if you look at that left-hand group, the OA only publishers have been increasing their fully open prices sort of year on year. And I think there's evidence that it might be plateauing slightly, whereas the fully open journals amongst the mixed model publishers seem sort of largely to be following a horizontal line. I know it's sort of wiggling up and down. So it seems that the prices from the fully open publishers have now caught up with the fully open prices from the mixed model publishers. So again, back to this question of are we seeing the market maturing? What might be driving price increases? I mean, again, I suspect there's a number of reasons for that. Again, as I mentioned, I think just maturity of the market. Perhaps there's more younger journals in that left-hand group, because many of the fully open publishers are younger publishers than, of course, their mixed model counterparts. But that said, of course, all publishers continue to open new journals or acquire journals, or indeed acquire publishers. So I'm sure it will be a little bit of both. I mean, again, Heather, I'm interested to hear your thoughts or observations on this.
Yeah, you went there in like the last phrase, with the publishers being acquired. I think it would be really interesting to look at, how much of that pure OA in the mixed model portfolio are the BMCs, are the Hindawi. Yep. And maybe it's a factor of the acquiring publishers being a little bit more hands-off than they might continue to be, or less emphasis on starting new journals. I know a lot of the societies that we talk to are thinking about what might be down the road for them in terms of additional titles. So we could see how the acquired titles moving in, as a kind of a cohesive portfolio is clashing or interacting with the publishers started OA journals, kind of
Yeah.
like imagining like a when galaxies collide thing happening. And just there's a lot of different influencing factors that may come to play there.
I have
Yeah.
a question here in the Q&A around evidence of price sensitivity from authors. And of course, we do a lot of market research where we're talking to researchers and for specific journals, for specific organizations and specific specialties. But anything in the data itself, Dan or Heather, that gives us any indication whether there's price sensitivity there?
Yeah, I will come on to that in a second. I wanted to quickly just finish off a point Heather made about different
sorry.
imprints.
Go ahead.
No, it's fine. This is interactive. This is
Yes.
it's the whole thing. So in terms of breaking out imprints of Biomed Central, etc., compared with the standalone fully open publishers, we do have that in our data. I've actually just completed breaking that out. So we can start to look into that. You start to find if you do that, then the kind of the OA imprints, or what's the best way of putting this? If you move the kind of the Biomed Centrals Hindawi's out of the right-hand bars into the left-hand ones, the two sets become slightly closer in shape. Let's put it like that. So there's probably some evidence there, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. So certainly in our tool, subscribers to our tool, we'll be rolling that out soon, and we may well do a piece on that, see if we can pull out some interesting trends comparing embedded imprints with sort of standalone publishers. Then in terms of price sensitivity amongst authors, so the joys of working with data is you have to keep an open mind because the world does move on and the measures move on with it. And Michael and I published a paper, I think a few years ago now, looking at just this issue, and we concluded there was no price sensitivity as measured if you take impact as a proxy for authors' perception of quality. So let me unpick that a bit. We plotted price against measures of impact. Big disclaimer, I absolutely know we should not be judging research, authors, institutions, etc., solely by citation-based metrics. But let's be honest, a lot of people do. A lot of people do focus on things like the journal impact factor. So we felt that as a sort of proxy, that was just a good way of kind of getting a handle on, are people shopping around, and more particularly, are publishers setting prices based on that? So are they charging more for higher impact journals? A few years ago, we found there was very little relationship between the two. The single biggest predictor of price was basically whether it's hybrid or not. I think that remains the case. But in the last year or two, we are beginning to see examples of that. And again, we've got some visualizations where we're seeing the plot between price and impacts now, instead of being just a big amorphous blob, meaning no relationship, is beginning to show signs of following a kind of line or a trend on the chart, particularly when we analyze it by the publisher level. So we're beginning now to see that in general, the higher the kind of citation impact of a journal on average, then the higher the APCs with sort of a loose relationship. But so I think we may be beginning to see some evidence of correlation, whether the cause is a price sensitivity and the fact that authors are now shopping around, or whether it's an effect of publishers looking into their pricing policies and thinking that it's they can charge perhaps a bit more for journals that have a higher perceived brand or a higher impact. I don't know. As ever, correlation is not causation. But to sort of pull apart that question, short answer is yes, there now seems to be a little bit more of a relationship
Yeah,
between.
I would add you maybe a couple of things on there. The perceived impact or the SNP versus the cost of APCs, as you mentioned, is kind of an amorphous blob when you look at it overall. But interestingly, when you start to dig into it a little bit by subject area, you can see, in some instances, journals that kind of punch above their weight in terms of their perceived impact and maybe a relatively lower or middle cost APC. So I think that as a tool, if an author if a researcher was to talk to a librarian and say, I have got this potential to publish, at a 5,000, APC, could go on and do a little bit of investigation to see, where that particular journal falls compared to some of the journals the author might also be considering, to see whether how the value for money compares. So that I always like to dig into those kinds of examples. And then the other thing, which I'm keeping an eye on, is for transfer journals within a publisher's family. In many instances, somebody might start with a submission to the flagship journal, and then if indeed they are offered a transfer, that the journal they're transferring to may well be priced at a lower APC. And I could imagine, if it did seem that there was price sensitivity in the future, offering that to authors as an option, could really be something we could see take off.
Yep.
One quick question here, Dan, if you want to talk about methodology just a little bit. We have a question about the discounts that are offered for APC, and if they're taken into consideration when we're looking at these APC pricing.
Short answer is no, because we want to compare like for like. So these are list prices. The good side of that is we are comparing like for like, because of course different publishers have different levels of discount and different discounting policies. If you like, the downside of this method is you can't multiply the average prices here up by the numbers of articles published and get a sense of revenue, because of course, for exactly the same reasons. But we felt taking those list prices was the best way of comparing like for like across different publishers with different policies, and so on. And then similarly, that's the reason we are light on the CC BY license price, so that we can also control out price differentials between different levels of permissiveness in publication. But I hope that answers that question on methodology. So
go on before we
yeah.
do more questions. Yeah.
So next couple of charts will actually get us into spreader prices. Heather, I'm going to kick this first one over to you, if I may.
Yeah, Dan always gives me the ones that are complicated, where you're like, what is happening? I love to see the updated version of this. Many of you are familiar with the open access data and analytics tool, will know that this is a curve that's drawn based on the histogram, where all of the different APCs are put into the buckets. And it's always exciting, to kind of see what happens. So what's going on here? The older years are in the darker green color. As we get closer to the present, it moves into more of the orange and gold. The tippy top there, just underneath the number one, is last year's peak. And then the new data is shown in the bright pink, or kind of orangey pink on my screen. So, first of all, last year we saw the shift to the arrow that's pointing towards the right. What had been more and more journals in a slightly lower APC range, we saw it jump over to where that number one is now. And while we still see that price point as the most popular, there aren't as many journals that are falling into that price point this year. And we can talk about some reasons for that. But a few other things just want to point out before we get into the discussions. So at the lower right, for number two, because we wanted to kind of zoom in and give some detail on what's happening in the center, the highest price point APCs are off the chart, according to the scale that you see here. Just again to keep it interesting. And then we've got two parts of this curve that are labeled with number three, and what we see is the base of that peak is getting broader, is getting wider. So as on the right hand number three, that curve used to be a really steep drop off back in those green years, and that's been getting more and more shallow with a relatively large bump there this year. So publishers are getting smarter about putting those journals that are maybe not at a little bit more than the higher price up. I call this like publisher money ball. If you can get a little bit more out of that end journals, then maybe you can play around with your pricing, elsewhere on the curve. What we see just to the left-hand side of the bottom there, the second number three, is, again, we were starting to see more journals there with slightly lower APC price points, but that looks like that trend is stalling a little bit. So that's one of the things that I'm going to keep my eye on going a little bit further. Dan, is there anything I missed with this?
I don't think so. One thing I should point out, those amongst you with eagle eyes will notice there are no numbers on the axes. I think it's the same with the very first chart. Subscribers to our tool can see all of this, drill into the data. For presentation purposes here, we really just wanted to talk about the broad patterns. So I'm thinking of my high school physics teacher who would tell me off for not labeling everything immaculately. And then in terms of, Heather, you mentioned there's sort of fewer journals in the peak. So the total number of journals is the area under the line. So if you've got a shorter, fatter line, the chances are you may still have pretty much the same number of journals as a skinnier, taller one. But we think this year there are fewer hybrids, maybe sort of 5 to 10% fewer in our sample compared with last year. It could be interesting to explore why that might be. Are a chunk of hybrids now going fully open, perhaps responding to things like transformative journals, perhaps things like that? Could it be that they're moving to sponsored journals or just closing down because, of course, journals do stop as well as start? So I think there seems to be a slight shifting in terms of the numbers of journals falling under the hybrid bucket overall. And then the other thing I'd say about this curve is it speaks to price optimization, as Heather said. I really love that phrase, publisher Moneyball. Something we'll look into over the next month or two is to plug in numbers of articles flowing through these kind of prices to get a sense of how that Moneyball game might be playing out. I think that'll be some interesting analysis to dig into. But I would say if you're looking just average prices per journal down your list, if you put a few journals up a bit and a few journals down a bit, then the average will stay pretty much the same. But the revenues you bring in, or the amount of money you're spending on those journals, if you're buying, of course, that could vary quite a lot. And I think 2 or 3 years ago, we put out a piece entitled "When Does Up Mean Down?" around pricing to make that point that the different headline price rises can actually result in very different revenues and costs, or indeed different headline price rises or falls can result in the same change in money changing hands. So there's, I think, quite a lot of subtlety going on underneath these charts, and especially for publishers with many journals who've got that ability to move prices around. I think there is quite a lot that can be done for price optimization there. And then I guess if we move to the next slide, so we've been looking at hybrids. This is fully open. So Heather kicked this to me and said, look, this is even more complicated. So I can put this up. So again, the darker greener lines are the older years moving through to it's a very sort of heavy line. It's actually red on my monitor. That's the more recent one. And I think if you look at the lines, so two things stand out. Number one, if you look just the peak of the curves, the kind of about a third from the left of the chart, they've gone up pretty well year by year. So what this chart is saying, we seem to be seeing more and more fully open journals available. The area under the chart seems to be growing. The chart does not include fully open journals that are sponsored, so they don't charge any APC. If you added those in, all of the lines would leap up to the left. There's probably about twice as many journals that are fully open with no charge compared with what we're seeing here, just roughly. So numbers of fully open journals appear to be increasing overall. And then there's this sort of wiggliness, to use a technical term, about the most common price bands. That there seem to be two peaks. If you look at the darker lines at the bottom, you'll see a little mini peak at kind of bottom left, and kind of middle where the dotted line just starts. So that seemed to be the earlier days, and then over the years the most common fully open price point seems to be conglomerating into quite a broad spread of prices. Last year, so it's the curve with the highest single peak. They seem to be consolidating into one clear most common price point. But this year we now seem to be heading back to having these sort of two popular price points for fully open journals. So headline is more fully open. There seems to be quite a broad spread of common price points, but it's quite complicated, and so hence the wiggly lines. I think, are there anything to add to
I
that?
was gonna say, we can see that the fully OA publishers are playing Moneyball as well, if we look at
Yeah,
what's
yeah,
right.
yeah, absolutely. The sort of right-hand side of the line, as you look at it, has got fatter and shallower. So, but yeah, I think but more sort of mid to high or high to mid prices seem to be being deployed.
And Dan, you mentioned that we do not have the 0 or no APCs
Yeah.
depicted here, but that is in the OA
Yeah.
data. So that is
Yeah.
information that's available. So
Yeah. And a piece of analysis I'd like to do when I hope again maybe later this year is just to have a quick look at numbers of journals that don't charge any APC, so might be deemed sponsored or diamond or platinum depending on your color of choice. Compare those sorts of numbers with the paid for fully open and paid for hybrid. Just I think it will give us a sense of the balance of the landscape and where publishers are placing their bets, because I think that notion of a sponsored journal is quite a powerful one. I think that is a very important source of revenue for many publishers, and of course it allows those big institutional deals or those sort of big subscription deals to be able to be cut, especially thinking things like transformative agreements and so on, might start to lean towards that. So it'll be interesting to see how the market pans out and whether there's shifts in numbers of journals either way.
yeah, and I think, Dan, when you say sponsored journals, we typically think of more of almost like a kind of a corporate-y type sponsor relationship, but I am hearing more and more of the possibility of sort of a foundation type approach.
Yeah.
A number of different funding sources are pooled so that there is not a one-to-one, relationship with any particular journal.
Absolutely, and sponsored could be me betraying my old manufacturing engineering roots. Yeah, I mean it could be foundation funded, government funded, absolutely right, etc.
Could be just the society funding.
Yeah,
for
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah. So we have a number of questions and about 20 minutes left. So I'm gonna suggest we
sharing
move.
so that
we move to some of these questions if you're both ready for that.
Yeah.
All right. So we have someone asked a question really early on, so patiently waiting. Are we keeping track of the journals that flip from hybrid to fully OA? And was there a spike in 2022, or apparently they've had an anecdotal experience of that sort?
So short answer is sort of and don't know. I'll expand those. We track flips at 2 levels. We have a headlines feed that we put out. I think that's open to anyone to subscribe to. And that if there's an announcement about a flip journal, things will appear there. So that gives you the sort of, if you like, the qualitative view. Quantitative, it's something I'm working on. We have done reports to a couple of people looking at flip journals, so it is something we can dig into. The challenge, however, at the sort of purely quant view, is spotting what's actually flipped versus a journal where the data has just simply not spotted fully open output in the early years, because quite often new journals have very few articles that come out, or some of the data sources may misclassify open articles in hybrid journals as fully open or vice versa. So we have to take a view as to how small we go, so we can get rid of, if you like, the noise in the data. But yes, it's something we're looking into. And then my don't know is because I haven't fully looked into it yet, I honestly can't comment as to whether there has been a spike in flipped journals. I suppose intuitively we'd expect to start to see more activity there, just based on the kind of funder policies that we're seeing coming through. Heather, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, it's something that I'm keeping a close eye on. I know you've been thinking for a while, even before the latest Plan S, announcement about no longer supporting transformative journals, that we are going to get close to the end of the specified period for that, and we would see fewer journals declaring themselves transformative journals, and I think that is indeed playing out. So as you say, I think we would we'll start to see anyone who's meeting those criteria, for the flip, make a decision as to whether they need
Yeah.
to. So.
Yeah.
In
And that
a,
activity, I'm sorry, Laurie.
oh, go ahead, Dan.
I said that, yeah, you're right. I think that activity will start to increase as we get closer to the deadline. And then we've also seen some publishers' societies committing to moving to a fully open portfolio over the next few years. So again, that might start to feed into the flips of journals, because they're more, I suspect, more likely to be long-standing journals that change, if that's the case.
Would you say that they are not going to be
Yeah,
moving?
yeah.
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 So yeah, well, watch this space. We'll continue to dig into that. I think it's a very fascinating question. Thank you.
On a related note, are we seeing publishers, or how are we seeing publishers adjust their prices when they convert a hybrid to fully OA? Are they keeping, if they had an author select, or whatever their hybrid price, OA price was, are they keeping that? Are they changing it lower, higher? Are we tracking that at all?
So I suppose we haven't done a sort of longitudinal study purely based on the data. I mean, that might follow. It'll be a really good addition to the flip analysis to see if we can spot the journals that have flipped and then look at whether their prices have changed. So yes, duly noted. I'll add that to my list of homework. I think in sort of anecdotal terms, because we do work with publishers modeling what if and what pricing they might want to set. I think the headline there is your mileage may vary. It will really depend, I think, on the publisher, their appetite, their area, or subject disciplines, how they see themselves. So I'm not sure there's any obvious pattern there.
Yeah, I'd say I see a closer examination of what peer journals are charging, as a guide, than necessarily trying to get the two price points that you may have had already closer together. I also think we're going to see some instances where there are relationships between families of journals, and the pricing for APC, say for like a flagship, is going to be subsidizing some of the newer journals. So I don't know that, again, we'll see trying to move one price point closer to another, but looking portfolio wide, trying to think comprehensively, and more factors coming into play as we move forward. It's definitely getting more complicated.
Just to move back to the last slide that we had up, we had a question on that in terms of those two peak distribution points on the OA prices, and any analysis or thoughts as to what might be driving that.
Honest answer, really don't know. I remember when we did it this time last year, we had a whole sort of spread, and I thought, well, as the market matures, it may well be we see people alight on a particular, most obviously most common price point. That's exactly what happened this time last year. So I was quite surprised to see us go back to a more humpy chart, more technical terminology. Statisticians on the call, please look away now. But I mean, genuinely don't know. It could just be, I think, a symptom of a market in transition where people are experimenting, or maybe where we are seeing a beginning of flips from other journals. And of course, if you take a journal that has not charged an APC and you suddenly start charging for it, you might want temporarily to reduce the prices just to allow your authors just to get used to the fact that the thing's being charged for. And it usually takes a while for people to transition into new models. So maybe that's one of the drivers.
It would also be really interesting to dig into subject areas. I mean, I always find an excuse, and every time I present, to say that I'm a historian. People are sick of hearing it, but I think the historians and the English professors may well be like amongst the last to move. But as there now is a greater understanding and appreciation from the pandemic, particularly folks in the social sciences wanting to make sure that the populations that they work with to do their research will have access to the output. It may well be that we're seeing more activity, in those subject areas, which cannot carry as high an APC price.
Yeah,
So
that's a really, really good point.
We have a question around subscribe to open and how we follow those journals or those portfolios, and if they're included in the analysis anywhere, how we're tracking that.
So they only appear in this analysis insofar as they might they might appear in it or not. So we don't necessarily call them out separately. Again, I think that it could be something that's interesting to dive into, although I'm not sure there's a huge number of them. I mean, Heather, we talk about this occasionally, don't we? When we do track example open access models in all of their many multifaceted glory, and of course, subscribe to open is one of those. I think that there's relatively
Yeah, I
few.
mean, it was interesting at the electronic resources and libraries that happened a few weeks ago. There were some really well attended sessions on subscribe to open and talking about the community of practice and the like. And it's a different animal than what we're looking to, because the fact that there's not a kind of an APC unit. The unit that you look at is the subscriber unit, the number of libraries who are supporting. And it would be interesting to take some examples from a publisher that had, hybrid portfolios and look at their article growth, pre and post, subscribe to open, and see, had they gone a different way, what might that picture look like. So I'm giving Dan more homework as we speak.
And I think to just in general to people on the call, please do email us if you've got questions and things. I mean, A, what you'd like to find out about, so subscribe to open is a very good question, and B, any specific things you're looking to understand, so what's the interest in subscribe to open? Is it, as Heather suggests, are we looking at article growth, or is it revenues, or is it I don't know, pricing? Please do reach out, because of course the more we know of the sort of questions people are asking and the sort of topics they're interested in, the more we can direct our research and then hopefully come back to a future webinar and answer some of these questions.
And we do track the different models. So as there are more variations amongst subscribe to open, as it affects different subject areas, different types of publishers, one of the great things you can do with OADAT is, if you've got a new member of staff who has not worked in OA before, or someone who's worked on a different touch point, you can talk to editorial boards about it, or authors. You can go in and we do have all the business models lined up nicely in there, and the differences, the pros and cons, those types of things.
Great. So this it's a good question. That's more, I think, qualitative than quantitative. Do we think it's inevitable that research funders will push back on high APCs and require researchers to publish in lower cost OA titles? And just a comment about them driving publishers to OA. So will they be influencing journal selections for authors? Any thoughts around that?
I'll just jump in. I don't necessarily think it's inevitable. I think the push from hybrid APCs, hybrid journals, to fully OA is kind of a philosophical and more of a state of mind. And the reason a lot of funders got into the talking about the shift to OA was truly so that it would not replicate some of the inequities from the subscription based model. So I don't know that the drive for lower APCs will necessarily flow from that. It could, in that folks like Coalition S are looking at transparency around APCs and tiered APCs and lots of different ways to kind of get away from the APC maybe rut that we've fallen into. But I think funders have different objectives, and in the way that universities don't necessarily want to hinder any academic freedom in terms of where to publish. I think if it's open and you're comparing open to open, whether the cost is different there. I would love to hear from the funders of what their thoughts are, but I don't necessarily think it would be inevitable.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And in some ways, it just may be inherent. We see that fully open journals are being priced at a much lower level than hybrid. So in some ways, the market might be doing the work there. I wonder if will authors shop around, and are the funders expecting the authors to do that, or will it be a case of publishers experimenting with price rises? If they get away with it, they'll stick. If not, they won't. And I suppose there is the other angle of, I know the Plan S move to at least ask for explanations of where the money goes as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe a hint on that. And I think a few years ago, I think it was one of the Austrian funders did put a price cap on APCs, but like that never really spread. There wasn't, it didn't suddenly turn out that whatever it was, 2,000 euros, or whatever the number was, became sort of the ipso facto level. So yeah, kind of what Heather said.
Do we have an estimate of overall market size and total APC expenditure for 2022?
Yes, we do. We do an annual sizing model. I saw that question come up and thought, I don't have the number in my mind. It's about $1 billion market now, open access, off the top of my head, 1.1 billion. We have put that out into the public domain. So a previous one of these webinars, one of the pieces on our website covers the numbers. So rather than misquoting myself, I think we should be able to send out a link or something.
Yeah, we'll see if we can find a link
Yeah.
now and put it in the chat too.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
And then similarly, there's the value of the market. I've also noticed another question coming in about, do we track the global usage of OA articles? That's all wrapped up in that sizing. As Heather and Laurie will tell you, I can bore you to death about methods on that. But we do try and get a sense of how much stuff is being published, what it's worth, and how does that break down between fully open in hybrid, and public access. So that's open, but without reuse rights, and then everything else. So we've done a whole bunch of work on that. But the headline in the methodology is, your numbers again may vary. It will depend on what discipline you're publishing in. And it will also depend on what you constitute to be a sort of scholarly journal or not. There's about 70 or 80,000 journals off the top of my head in Crossref. So that, could theoretically have a DOI of a paper, because some of those might be trade journals, or some of those might be conference proceedings and so on. So we, alongside, I think, the other indexes, will take a view of what's the appropriate subset. We focus on what we term the addressable market, which we think is the sort of the main core where the economic activities are likely to lie. But depending on the project, we may bring in other indexes depending on
and I think, Dan, that a lot of the things that you've said are around like uptake of OA. But if we take usage in the term of, we use it most commonly in libraries and publishing. Counter has been doing some really interesting work to look at OA usage. The latest Counter code of practice, has done a lot more around OAs. Become really important for libraries to be able to look at their OA usage in the same way that they look at their subscription usage, but it's not always possible to attribute that, and usually not possible to attribute that, to an institution. So I do a lot of work with Counter. I was a past board member, currently on the executive committee. So those who have an interest in how usage of OA, is playing back, I'm always happy to have a conversation about that. So.
Heather, we have a question specifically for you in the Q&A. You were talking earlier about looking at peer journals and what is being charged for APCs, whether it's hybrid or gold. So the questioner was just asking you to elaborate a bit on that. And are you saying that they're more likely to consider overall average APCs regardless of model?
I think the first question was, if you had a hybrid price and you had a gold price, are you going to try to either move the gold so that it's closer to the hybrid, or somehow the hybrid kind of goes closer to the gold? And I think that's sort of within your portfolio pricing. It's more important to look at what other folks are doing than to necessarily just live within your universe. You could try to balance the books that way. I mean, that might be a way to go. But if you put your gold APCs up really high, and the journals that you would consider your peer journals are not, then you may, even though we do not necessarily think there's a price sensitivity, you might cause some unintended consequences. So I think when we have publishers that are looking and, doing investigating. We do a lot of these competitive analysis projects. They want to know what type of journals are their author group going to. We do a lot of interview projects where we actually kind of try to dig into why this is possible. What are the APCs associated with those? Are they gold or are they hybrid? What have the trends been there? And then again, I hate to keep harping on this, but I do think it's something that's fascinating to take up a lot more of our brain power to work on for projects, is these relationships between journal families and how the APC prices are not just done in isolation, but looking at appropriate price points for things that are transferring, and the like. And so I don't think it works like a family, balancing the books and just moving, one. You really need to know what's going on, in that wider context, and think about different options. And that stuff we work on every day.
I'm going to start to close out here. We've got just a couple of minutes left. So last question, 60 seconds. We've talked about some findings and data points here. We've touched on what more you can see in the open access and data analytics tool if you're a subscriber. Anything more around the OA.DAT and what more can be seen? Or
I'll just add, I noticed when I was looking over the registration list, we do have a lot of folks from the library side. And I'm always eager to find out more about how libraries, are using the tool, either to prepare themselves for negotiations around transformative agreements, trying to find out if the deal that they're being offered, is a good one, if there's one price of an APC, or where the patterns of publication are falling on that continuum of different APC buckets. So that's something that I'm hearing from librarians more and more. And if for librarians who are on the call today that want to have a conversation, I'd love to hear the questions that you're asking.
Great. All right. That is a wrap for us today. Many thanks, Heather and Dan. Great conversation. And thank you all for your great questions. Very, very lively group this morning or this afternoon, depending upon where you're located. We'll have more APC related news and views coming up in the next month, so stay tuned. And we're on the road again, which many of you probably are as well. Lots of stuff coming up. This is conference season. So I will be at UKSG. Dan and I will both be at the London Book Fair. Heather and Dan will be at STM, and then we'll have a contingent at CSE and SSP. So please reach out. We'd love to meet with you in person, or if you'd like a one-on-one call, we're happy to set that up too. So thanks everyone for attending. We will be sending out the recording for those of you who have attended today and registered. And feel free to share that with your colleagues who may not have been in attendance. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.